Good morning. I'm heartened to see that last week's service didn't keep too many people away from this week's service. And I just have to note, I loved the music before the service. Of course, I was being carried back to my teenage years, and in my mind's eye was sitting on a beach with a bottle of illegal wine and a ukulele. Carole King sounds a lot better on the piano than the ukulele. But it is, in my mind, a sort of a Unitarian Universalist communion. A bottle of wine, a beach, a ukulele, and Carole King. The opening words are from Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things.
I do not particularly like driving. And when traffic is heavy and I'm running late, which is more often than I'd like to admit, I get impatient and frustrated so quickly. So I don't drive that much beyond my regular commute here from Vancouver. And when I first started to make this commute north in the mornings, I noticed I began to really look forward to crossing the bridge. I know, not so much getting onto the bridge, but actually driving across. Lionsgate or the Ironworkers, it didn't really matter which one it was, because on either one, as I would make it to the crest of the bridge, I would, for just a few moments, get to experience that amazing view of our coastal mountains. And as I realized how much I came to look forward to this tiny moment of noticing, of seeing, of connecting, I decided to be intentional about it. That every time I drove north, I would notice the mountains. I'd pause whatever other thoughts were running through my mind, and I'd ask myself, what are the mountains doing today? Was there fog and mist, brilliant sun? Were they snowy yet? Could I even see them through the rain? And so it was on Thursday, as I was running late again and so frustrated with the slow and ridiculously heavy traffic for the middle of the day. And then I got to the middle of the bridge and I caught sight of the mountains, all shadowy grays that day. And I took a breath and really looked. And in taking in the sight of the mountains, my vision widened suddenly. And I was reminded that I was not only my frustrated self in my car. I was also a part of the same web of life as these ancient mountains. And so were all the other drivers zooming all around me. And all of a sudden I had a new perspective. And the traffic wasn't quite as bad. And so I dedicate the lighting of our chalice, symbol of our faith, to the gift of vision and the insight that can come from noticing what is right before you.
The words for centering are from my friend and mentor, the Reverend Dr. John Cummins, who for many years was minister of the First Universalist Church of Minneapolis. No soul that ever lived, no spirit, however dim, no life, however brief, has ever tread this strange and wondrous journey between the gates of birth and death without leaving its precious and unique bequest with the ongoing stream of life. Each life, unique in itself, a one-time, never before and never again event, leaves an impression on the human story. It is the immortality of influence. And there is a kind of moral equation in all this. It is that our mistakes and weaknesses, and we all have them, will one day die with us. But our victories of character remain to bless humanity forever. If what a person has said is true, and if what a person has done is good, then that goodness and that truth will never end. Last night there was a fireworks display across the inlet in Vancouver. I heard it before I saw it. And I have to say that the sound of the fireworks seemed magnified far beyond the brightness of the light that was being generated. The light involved small flashes on the horizon, but the sound of the fireworks boomed and echoed surely across the entire North Shore. I have no idea why the fireworks were going. For all I know, this happens over in Stanley Park every weekend of the year. But it was quite a little display. And it reminded me that back home in Manitoba Cottage Country, there is a wonderful fireworks display at Spruce Sands every Labor Day weekend to mark the end of each year's cottage season. It used to remind me that I was going to have to return to work following Labor Day and start preaching and visiting congregations. Today it reminds me that the people who make the lake noisy during the summer months are going home, and I will enjoy a peaceful and quiet autumn in my summer retreat, which is really a year-round retreat, but we don't tell the municipality that because I'm not sure whether or not it might have tax implications. But every year when the Labor Day fireworks happen, I toddle off to the edge of the lake and I watch the fireworks in complete and utter amazement. Once again, I become 8 years old. Now, these days I worry about frightened dogs and deer, kittens and ferrets, whatever manner of pets and wildlife exist in the area, because I realize they don't like it much. It's intimidating. It's frightening, and yet there is something magical about the dance of the light in the skies, and the boom and the crackle and the oohs and the ahs from the people. There is just something magical about it. And so I hope the dogs and cats will forgive me, but I find delight in that once-a-year magnificent fireworks display. And who knew? Who knew that this year I would travel halfway across the country and get to watch the fireworks all over again? It was a delight. And there is a sense in which what delights us as children, if we are fortunate, comes back to us year after year through our adult years and helps us to be delighted with the rest of life too. Helps us to be charmed, to realize that the world really is enchanted, no matter how much wisdom to the contrary we may think we learn as adults. We live on an enchanted planet, and whether we realize it ourselves or not, our very lives are enchanted. And we require times, ideally times like Sunday morning at church, or when we go for a quiet walk in the woods or stroll along the ocean shore. We require those times to draw us back to remembering just how, well, frankly, impossible, unbelievable the whole nature of life really is. I mean, who would ever have thought of creating such a thing if we weren't simply born into it? There's a story often attributed to the anthropologist Loren Eiseley, if it's attributed at all, and you're likely familiar with it. The story goes, while wandering a deserted beach at dawn, stagnant in my work, I saw a man in the distance bending and throwing as he walked the endless stretch towards me. As he came near, I could see that he was throwing starfish, abandoned on the beach by the tide, back into the sea. When he was close enough, I asked him why he was working so hard at this strange task. He said that the sun would dry these starfish and they would die. I said to him that I thought he was foolish. There were thousands of starfish and miles of beach. One man alone could never make a difference. He smiled as he picked up the next starfish. Hurling it far out into the sea, he said, "It makes a difference for this one." I abandoned my writing and spent the morning throwing starfish. Eiseley was an anthropologist and a philosopher, actually born on a September morning 111 years ago. He was once called the modern Thoreau by Publishers Weekly, a label that stuck. But I'd be more inclined to call him a cross between John Burroughs and Carl Sagan. He was a curious blend of scientist and poet, so his writings caught the public imagination from the publication of his classic work, The Immense Journey, in 1957, until his death 20 years later. And now, some 4 decades further on, his writings still inspire the imagination and stir the heart. He grew up on the outskirts of Lincoln, Nebraska, where his father was a low-paid hardware salesman with aspirations to be a Shakespearean actor. It's a wonderful story, this story that's attributed to Loren Eiseley when people remember to attribute it, but it's actually not what he wrote in The Star Thrower. I hate to break your heart, especially if you're a devoted social activist who has spending your days and nights for years throwing stars back into the ocean, but it's simply not what he wrote. He actually wrote that in a pool of sand and silt, a starfish had thrust its arms up stiffly as if in death and was holding its body away from the mud. "It's still alive," he said to himself. "Yes," said the star thrower. There really was a star thrower. "Yes," and with a quick but gentle movement, the star thrower picked up the star, threw it over Eiseley's head, and far out into the sea. It hit the water, the wave, well, it's not really a wave, the splash went up, and the waters roared once more. "There are not many who come this far," Eiseley actually said, groping in sudden embarrassment for words, he acknowledged. "What do you say? Do you collect?" Eiseley asked the star thrower. Only like this, he said softly, gesturing amid the wreckage of the shore, and only for the living ones. And he stooped again, oblivious to Eiseley's curiosity, skipped another star across the ocean, and said, the stars, they throw well, and one can help them. Wasn't quite the altruistic story that gets repeated over and over again and reposted on a regular basis on social media. Eiseley himself said, I do not collect. The wind was beating at his garments. He explained, I do not collect neither the living nor the dead. I gave it up a long time ago. Death is the only successful collector. Now I'm here to tell you that if people knew what Loren Eiseley originally wrote, they would not be reposting him on social media. He would not be invoked at Canadian Unitarians for Social Justice meetings, and we wouldn't feel so warm and fuzzy after hearing the whole story. And yet, do you collect? Turns out that I am a collector. I'm a collector of nature and its marvels. I'm a collector of people like you. I'm going to steal you and take you home with me when I leave here today. I will collect the memories and the new relationships. I will collect the wonderful stories I've heard here. I will collect the example of what this congregation is, and I will steal it and take it home in my sack, and I will share it with other congregations when I visit them. I may even write about you in my newspaper, even though I'm only certain of one Icelander other than me being in the room. But I'm going to take you with me because I'm a collector. I collect life's experiences, and I've come to think it's a good idea. It's the only kind of theft that we can get away with impunity, save for the price we pay in the way that it changes us when we collect the stories and the experiences of other people. But I've been a collector since I was a boy. In fact, when I was a boy, I had a pair, and they would never, actually they wouldn't fit my leg now. I had a pair of those pants that were called beachcombers. And it had a white rope belt that I tied it up. And it came down just below the knee so I could wade along the water's edge. And as it happened, my earliest memories of being a beachcomber, something else I continued to be, was wandering along the shoreline at Point Roberts, not too far south of here, with my grandfather, who was one of my childhood heroes. I saw my first killer whale not in an aquarium, but off the edge of Lighthouse Point, leaping from the ocean. When I heard the name, I would not turn around. I was actually like the choir, only I was shaking because there were killer whales in them there parts, and we didn't call them orcas when I was a kid. They were killer whales, and the very name intimidated me, which made my grandfather laugh, and so he spun me around and held me on his shoulders so that I would have a better view. When you see a killer whale leap out of the water, it's very hard to be afraid unless you happen to be a fish. And so there I was along the shore of Point Roberts, learning how to bother the clams in the sand, learning how to observe the wildlife out at sea, which was otherwise hidden unless you were in a boat. And I learned how to collect things. Rocks, shells. I'm afraid to say I took one of those starfish home with me, and I'm not entirely sure whether it was a throwback one or a take-home one, but it's still in my collection. I've been collecting nature and collecting people who are, after all, just a part of nature. Just with all of the ramifications of that, with all the beauty and the richness and the glory of being a part of nature, what more could we ask than to be simply part of the ongoing stream of life in this magnificent natural world in which we live? I learned these lessons out here on the West Coast when I was a boy, and I took them home. I collected those lessons and took them home and learned how to look at the environment where I lived a little more closely. Because the truth is, when I was 8 years old, I already had a plan to get the heck out of Dodge. Well, Winnipeg. Same thing. I had a plan to leave because Winnipeg, when I was a boy, was the absolute most barren, boring place in the whole world. And I knew this in my heart until I was about 17 or 18 years old, when the prospect of being able to leave actually presented itself. And my heart was changed by my then girlfriend's and later wife's grandmother. I started dating my wife on my 16th birthday. We attended a concert featuring Valdi and the Hometown Band. You may be familiar with them. And we stuck. One of my collections, I suppose. We stuck and we bonded, and I became a part of her life. My wife is the descendant of Japanese immigrants to the West Coast who were forcibly relocated to the center of the continent, leaving behind everything that they had built and known here. Everything. Everything of tangible value, but they collected and brought themselves to the barren prairies where they were exploited as farm laborers on sugar beet farms. And my wife and I happened to have the good fortune to grow up a mile apart. I had known her for about 2 years before I realized that her grandmother, Bachan, spoke English. I'm not proud. I can only imagine that Bachan thought that her granddaughter, as sweet and wonderful as she was, had landed a real prize. And I mean that with the full sarcasm of the term. A real prize, a guy who couldn't even understand when people were speaking to her. And it was after a couple of years that I realized that if I listened through the accent and watched her closely as I listened, that I could actually hear what she was saying to me. And around about the time where I was just getting ready to go to university in some place like Australia or Bemidji, Minnesota, just about that time, I said to her, Bachan, it must have been awful to be relocated from the West Coast with all its majestic beauty, with its soaring mountains and its roaring seas. It must have been awful to be relocated to Manitoba, where nothing happens and the terrain shows no evidence of, well, being a terrain. She looked at me and she said, I was born near Toyama, Japan, between the mountains and the sea. Our home overlooked the Sea of Japan, and as a little girl, she said, I loved the sea more than I loved the mountains. She went on to say to me, if you watch a field of grain late in the season, as the wind blows across it, the field of grain will have waves like the Sea of Japan. She said sometimes the waves are almost crashing when they come to the edge of a field. Sometimes they're just gentle and rolling, but they are beautiful. And when I look at a wheat field, I feel at home. She went on to tell me about diamonds in the snow during the winter months, if I would only polish my glasses enough to pay attention. What she taught me was that the texture of life doesn't need to be dramatic to still be a texture, and that if I only looked closer to the ground, I might actually appreciate where I was planted, rather than figure out where I wanted to go. Her experience was that she was living very far from her childhood home, through more than one choice by someone else, but that she had learned to appreciate wherever she happened to be growing. And as it happened that day, I grew not a little more. I grew a lot from her wisdom. One of my favorite pastimes is genealogy. And it's not just that I love my own family and I'm curious about my own ancestors, which have expanded beyond Iceland, Germany, to France, and beyond Europe to now include Japan as individuals I call my ancestors. And it's expanded beyond my own biological family to include my spiritual family. And so when I go to Transylvania, where you have, you have a partner church in Hungary, I think. But when I go to the Hungarian churches in Eastern Europe and visit our Unitarian Universalist congregations there, I realize I am part of this magnificent phenomenon, this coming together of people that spans not just individual communities, but whole continents and the whole globe. And I realize in those moments that I am part of an ongoing stream of life, as surely everyone is. And so I do spiritual genealogy as well as family history. And I love to learn the stories of other people's families, the good and the bad stories, because our families are complex, which is something worth remembering when we recognize that our congregations can sometimes be complex and difficult too. It is worth remembering that we are part of this ongoing stream of life which Loren Eiseley, remember him? We're talking about Loren Eiseley this morning, which Loren Eiseley described as a caravan. We have joined a caravan, you might say, at a certain point. We will travel as far as we can, but we cannot in a lifetime see all that we would like to see or learn all that we hunger to know. And it is because we're part of this caravan that I think that we engage in the spiritual search in the first place. The quest of the spiritual seeker is little different than the curiosity of the scientist. It involves a recognition that we are part of a stream of life and not singular beings who live only in a particular moment of time and have only selfish interests. No, we're part of a caravan, a stream of life that has flown on since the leaf in a Devonian sandstone was met by a finger that reached out to touch it, as Eiseley said. We are part of this stream of life, part of a caravan. That's true of our families. For many of us, it's true of our workplaces. It's especially true for religious communities. The bonus I got for being with you this week was that I got to travel down to Point Roberts, where I learned how to be a beachcomber. I spent yesterday with my father's stepsister, who still lives in my grandparents' old farmhouse at the point. And when it was all over, I visited the familiar places. I got lost in the woods, full disclosure, because an area that has been threatened by development for half a century now, which was one way or another going to see condominiums or businesses pop up on it, an area where my great aunts used to pick flowers, so they named it Lily Point. That area has been turned into a park, and I just couldn't help myself. I went out because I used to go with my grandfather. We would walk along the road and we would reach a sign that said dead end, which he would comment on because the sign was just before the cemetery, which he called the bone orchard. And we would walk past the cemetery, and there was a big chain at the edge of Lily Point and a sign that said no trespassing. And what I remember as a boy was that my grandfather would routinely look at the sign and say, well, that's interesting, and step over it and hoist me over it with him. And then we would go down the bluff, which probably wasn't safe, and we would wander along the shore, casting starfish into the sea when we found them, looking for clams, taking home the shells that were no longer occupied, and collecting just enough rocks from the shore that little white rope belt on my beachcombers didn't work once, and my pants fell down to my ankles. I went out to Lily Point and I got lost in the woods, which it turns out is a wonderful place to go if you've forgotten who you are and need a reminder. My grandfather and everything that Point Roberts meant to me is part of the caravan of my life. Every congregation that I have worked with, and I have worked with many, have been a part of my life. This place was already a minor part of my caravan, but after spending a week with you, it's become a much larger car along the group of vehicles making their way down the pathway of life. Remember that you are a caravan and not a stopping place. Remember that this congregation has a rich history that now extends for longer than half a century and will undoubtedly extend far into the future. Remember to make room here for those who need a ride, and remember to help cultivate those who might lead that caravan of which you are a part. We are together, you and I and everyone else whose lives might be affected by this community. We are together part of an incredible but astonishing journey through life. And the good news is that I think we're good companions on that journey. Care for your caravan, enjoy the ride, and know that the future of this place, North Shore Unitarian Church, will be as interesting as its past and probably every bit as wonderful.
We extinguish this flame. With us, the light of vision and the warmth of hope. The world calls to us to live lives of greater depth, meaning, and purpose. We go forth with courage and love.
May the light around us guide our footsteps and hold us fast to the best and most righteous that we seek. May the darkness around us nurture our dreams and give us rest so that we may give ourselves to the work of the world. Let us seek to remember the wholeness of our lives, the weaving of light and shadow in this great and astonishing dance in which we move. Amen. Blessed be.